Hey everyone, I am Joe Rizzo with the Loudon Museum, and I am here with Jared Frederick, instructor of history at Penn State Altoona. And this is the first of a new series that we are hosting on our Facebook page for the Loudon Museum called Pour Over History. What it is just a weekly change on national topics, on local history topics, with historians and authors, the length of a cup of coffee, basically, conversation. So thank you to King Street Coffee for still being open in a safe manner, for keeping me caffeinated while I'm working from home. But let us know what you want to hear about as well. If you have topics you want to hear, speakers, let us know. This is something that's evolving, but we're excited to provide this new series for you on Facebook. And as I mentioned, I am here with Jared Frederick, instructor at Penn State Altoona, and I asked him to be the first person to join us for Pour Over History because he's got a new book out that looks at the topic of D-Day. And that book is Dispatches of D-Day, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion. So Jared, thanks for joining us for the first one of this series. How are you doing up in Penn State, during this whole weird time?
Oh, we're doing all right. We're making the transition as best as we can, teaching online classes, and I'm still trying to give my students the biggest bang for their buck when it comes to their education. So they're still learning.
Great. Well, I'm glad to talk to you again, and I'm happy that you're safe up there. But again, I really want to get into this book that you came out with, and I'm surprised when I saw it and started kind of reading some parts of it. What made you pick this topic? I mean, we both, I know, have a Civil War background back from our time in grad school. So I'm curious how you came on this topic and where that led you, and really, the Normandy Invasion as a topic as a whole, and then the book project.
My story about my book begins in a really unlikely place, and that's a dumpster.
History projects start, obviously.
Yes. One of my students one day brought in a pile of yellowed newspapers into class. Because in his words, he knew that I liked old stuff like this. And as it turns out, one of his older neighbors had passed away recently, and the family was cleaning house. And the neighbor had been alive during World War II, and they had saved all of these newspapers, years worth. Chronicling, what was going on both locally, nationally, and internationally during the World War II years. And despite the fact that the children and the grandchildren who were cleaning out the house didn't really have an appreciation for them, they meant something to the person who initially collected them in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. And so my student bequeathed me these papers. And, I started going through them, and there's just an amazing level of detail. And of course, newspapers were like double the size back then of what they are today in the pre-digital world. And the level of insight was just astounding. And so I thought, wow, there's really something here. And so what I initially planned to do, I wasn't initially planning to do a book. I just wanted to get some good, primary resource materials for students to work with in the classroom and for research papers and so on and so forth.
Right.
And it turned into this almost like a disease, like an addiction almost. I just kept going and going and going. And by the time it was all said and done, I had transcribed somewhere around like 500,000 words in newspaper reports about the Normandy Invasion, and not only how its participants experienced them, but how their family members, loved ones, and community members reacted to it back home. And in my mind, that was an angle of the Normandy Invasion that had never really been covered before, that examines both the battlefront and the home front simultaneous to one another. And so that's how it got started, and that's ultimately what I set out to do. And the book is the end product of that quest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm curious, between either the home front or the soldier accounts, is there a lot of differences between how people view the Normandy Invasion today to how they were speaking of it around the time?
Back then, I'd say the biggest difference as you know, today we look at D-Day and we consider it a turning point of World War II, and we see it as the part of this unstoppable tide of Allied progress and tightening the noose around the Axis neck, so to speak. But one thing that was evidently clear to me as I was researching and writing is that victory was not a foregone conclusion by anybody in 1944. People on the home front were deeply distressed about the potentials of the invasion of France, opening up the Western Front. And you know, they were paranoid about it. I mean, and everyone knew it was coming, but they didn't know when. And not even Eisenhower, had complete and utter confidence that this was going to succeed. The day before the invasion, on June 5th, the date that it was originally supposed to take place, but it was postponed by the weather, is that he penned what is essentially an admission of guilt, taking full blame for the responsibility of Operation Overlord failing. And so he was planning for every sort of contingency, and even that of failure, which I think speaks to his strength as a leader, that he was taking every possible consideration into account. And so I would say that's the one big thing psychologically that separates us 2020 versus 1944.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we have the hindsight. 2020 is our benefit. We know at the stages of war how the Axis powers are already kind of being pushed back, but we have that luxury. They didn't then. So again, this is still a front that's going to be open, and there's really no assurance of victory. So when you're doing the research, and then maybe when you even speak with the students, what are some of the key significant takeaways that you try to convey, whether you're talking about the book or in class, about the invasion?
Well, there's a few different ways to look at that, and I guess it depends on the class and the scope of the class. When I'm talking to college students, though, I press the point upon them that it was people their age who helped win the Second World War, whether on the Western Front, the Eastern Front, or in the Pacific. I mean, it was 20-year-olds who were flying these bombers and, steering these landing craft toward the beaches. Because, I think college students have a tendency of seeing World War II veterans as they are now and not as who they were. They see them as frail 95-year-old men. And it's hard for some of them to realize that a lot of those veterans were as, strong and athletic and as outgoing and troublesome as they are. So that's one thing that I press upon them. And with that power of hindsight, you can truly consider D-Day to be, one of those big turning points of the war. I don't think it's the turning point, as some historians have claimed. Stalingrad or, another major battle on the Eastern Front would probably claim that designation. Right. But it truly was the beginning of the end. And certainly the Soviet Union was happy about D-Day. They had been pushing the Allies to, relieve some of the pressure on them for a long time. And so that's one thing that I found in my research is Russians celebrated D-Day as heartily as what Americans did, because they realized that it was going to help them in the long run too.
That Stalin is pushing to open up the Western Front. We always view it as knowing the Cold War that's to come. But at the time, Stalin didn't know it was a sure thing that he'd be able to, beat the Germans back and start pushing them back westward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Stalin was getting thousands of airplanes and hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of small arms from the United States too. And so certainly ideas of a post-war tension between these two growing superpowers was probably on the back burner somewhere in some people's minds, but it certainly wasn't at the forefront in 1944.
Yeah, and for the soldiers who are writing about it, from the time or maybe soon after, really, what are the big takeaways that they're feeling? I mean, are they being pretty upfront and candid with their emotions? Are they guarded? Really, kind of what does it tell us about the individual soldiers and how they're viewing their experiences personally and maybe the war in general?
The firsthand accounts are incredible, and they differ a lot, in my view, from memoirs, which are written 50, 60, 70 years after the fact. And that's one reason why I really dug into this project, is that there was a sense of immediacy. I think their words were less shrouded by the fog of war as they would have been decades later. But to your point, their writings were incredibly candid, and in short, I was really just amazed by how much soldiers got away with writing. I thought that everything was going to be censored, that they weren't going to be able to talk about where they were or what they were doing. And that was hardly the case at all, minus a few places here and there where a name of a town or a unit might have been scratched out. American soldiers had the full liberty to write about their battle experiences as they saw fit. And some of them are incredibly graphic. Others are very moving. Some are comical, and you see this very wide range of emotion being expressed in them. Some of them are mournful of what they've gone through and how many of their buddies that they've lost. Others are jubilant because, they thought, yeah, I survived, and writing that first letter home after the invasion was something like a trophy for them. And it was, a symbol not only for their families, but for themselves that I survived this. And family members started getting mail around the 4th of July from a lot of invasion participants. And unfortunately, too, it was also around the 4th of July, 1944, when a lot of families started to receive Western Union telegrams indicating that, not everyone was coming home.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes me wonder, too. So these soldiers, they obviously go through a very, massive operation just to have a successful beachhead formed, but they don't break out of Normandy now for, a month and a half or so. Are they showing concern about, we've done this so far, but, we're not breaking through, we're not moving, through France yet? Or does it seem like they feel like they've had that big accomplishment and they know that there's going to be success coming down the road?
I don't know if they knew that success was coming down the road, but they were certainly optimistic of it. They saw this as the first big hurdle. And unfortunately for both they and their generals, what they didn't take into account was, the 100+ miles of hedgerow separating, them from Paris. And like you said, it took the better part of 2+ months for them to reach that stage. I think, though, once they got past the beaches, once they're several miles inland, everybody is breathing a collective sigh of relief. They know that this is not over. There is hopes for some of them, certainly, that this will be over by Christmas, which, too, is going to prove too lofty a goal in the long run. But they definitely felt better than what they had in England. Because, some of these guys were in the British Isles for 6 months prior to all of this. And, every week, the agitation just grows more and more and more. And so I think they had less of a feeling of being stir crazy. And, going stir crazy is something that we can all relate to right now.
We've got a sense of that.
Yeah. But, at the end of all this, we don't have to storm a beachhead. And so I think that's certainly the one big point of difference there. But they definitely saw that things were on the upswing.
So during this research, is there anything that really surprised you, whether, what they talked about, what they didn't talk about, throughout this research process, what would you say surprised you most?
There are two really big things that surprised me, or perhaps that I just didn't take into consideration before. One of which, something you alluded to a little bit earlier, was logistics. I mean, it was like a biblical feat, what these people pulled off. And, just one small anecdote to that, speaking to the numbers. In Pennsylvania alone, from the first half of 1944, the State War Manpower Commission told lumberers, guys cutting down trees up in the Pennsylvania wilderness, that they needed 400 billion board feet to meet D-Day needs. And all of that wood would be used for crates and packaging to ship over all of the supplies that was necessary. 400 billion board feet of timber. And that's only in Pennsylvania. And like, I read that number, and at first I had to read it 2 or 3 times to make sure I wasn't misreading it. And I thought, holy cow, like that's just monumental. And so that's just like one small nugget in the bigger story of logistics that kind of hit close home to me, being from Pennsylvania myself. The other thing too that completely caught me off guard, that I had never thought of before, is how D-Day tied into the civil rights movement in the 1940s. There are, over 1 million African Americans serving in uniform at the time that D-Day occurs, and of course they're serving in a segregated army. And there's a very active and prolific civil rights campaign that is happening back in the United States, which was largely pushed by newspapers, African American newspapers. And they were advocating, of course, for integration, for, better justice within the military system. And African Americans saw D-Day as kind of this reawakening or this rebirth of what it means to be an American. Black soldiers were proving themselves on the battlefield, including on the Normandy beachhead and beyond. And it tied into this belief and hope that if they prove their citizenship in foreign conflict, perhaps they'll have the privilege of being treated like citizens when they come back home. And so that was something that I read a lot about in newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the most read African-American newspaper at the time. But, all things told, my book is the story of how newspapers and the people engaging with newspapers perceive the war and how they perceive themselves at this really crucial time of history.
Yeah, you don't often think civil rights, while the war is taking place, and that being on the forefront of newspapers' minds or soldiers' minds also. That's really interesting. So Jared, for people who want to follow you, I know is it a Facebook page, Historian Jared Frederick?
That's correct.
And is there a website or anywhere you would suggest for people who wanted to get the book?
You can get them directly from me at jaredfrederick.com if you'd like, a signed or personalized copy. Otherwise, it's available for purchase on Amazon.
Awesome. And again, the book is Dispatches of D-Day, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion. Jared, thanks so much for being the first person interviewed with Pour Over History, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
My pleasure.
All right, take care, Jared. Stay safe.
Thank you.